How's it going, everybody? My name's Antonio. Thank you for being here. You're about to watch or listen to yet another episode of the 2023 Outlook series. On this one, I'm joined by Per Jander. He's going to tell you all about himself in a second. Who I'm not joined by, though, is your financial advisor. They're not going to be present here today, and this will be just a conversation. It's a general conversation, one that's impersonal in nature as well, and one that will not include any financial nor professional advice. But it's going to include a lot of our personal opinions, and it's going to include a lot of forward-looking statements and stuff like that. Stuff that you shouldn't blindly trust, just like you shouldn't blindly trust anything on the internet, really. So always double, triple check what people tell you, basically. And with all that said, I think that should be enough of a disclaimer. Per, thank you for investing your time in me today.
Hi, Antonio. Hi, happy to be here.
Pleasure is all mine, of course. I like most of the times when I talk to people who are as famous as you, I'd skip the introduction, but just for the off chance that somebody's been living under a rock, who is Per Jander and why should people listen to him?
That's actually the first time I've heard that I'm famous, because I'm a nerd by nature and mostly kind of focus in on the little narrow scope of the field that I'm in. But yes, my name is Per, and I am for this perspective, or for this purpose, I guess I'm an expert on the physical uranium market or physical nuclear fuel market. So I grew up in Sweden. Now I live in Boston, Massachusetts since about a year. I'm very happy here, and have been in the nuclear field for about 20 or so years, working at the Swiss utility, working at a Swedish utility, Cameco for over a decade. That's kind of where I really got into the uranium market. A little bit at a trade association as well, but ultimately my career circles around the nuclear fuel market. And the absolute majority of the work that I do is as the technical advisor for the SPUT Physical Uranium Trust. So we handle anything physical related to that trust. Whenever they raise money and need to buy some uranium, we go into the market and buy it for them, and also help them out on talking to investors and basically any kind of technical knowledge to support their marketing work or just education of people in general. So that's in short, that's what I do.
So you're pretty much helping John Ciampaglia take over the uranium market. Is that it?
Taking over, I'm not so sure. Sure, it's been a clear presence, but there clearly are other funds there. There certainly are traders there, but yeah, I'm John's sidekick nerd, absolutely.
Well, so you basically went from working at Cameco as a uranium seller more or less to now a uranium buyer. Why the switch, and like what's the difference that you're experiencing? How is it different? Talk to me about that.
Yeah, excellent question, actually, the one that I've never had before either, because Cameco, most of the time, at least they previously did, and I'm quite sure they're getting there as well, doing what most they refer to as over-contracting. So at the time when I was working there, they sold about 30 million pounds a year and produced about 20 million pounds. So they persistently about 10 million pounds short. Now, a good chunk of that was supplied by the Russian deal, the megatons to megawatts. So a deal with Russia where you got the downblending of highly enriched uranium from nuclear warheads into uranium that can be used in civil reactors. So that was a big chunk of that material. Obviously, that ended in about 2013, I believe. But you still had that over-contracted position. So Cameco was always a fairly big buyer in the market. And me, along with actually my colleague at WMC now, Mandeep Ludu, we did a lot of that buying. So I have more or less always been a buyer, but clearly also a seller and marketer of uranium and nuclear fuel to utilities, something that we carry on at WMC. And even though my biggest focus is with SPUT, my colleagues at WMC, they focus very much on marketing nuclear fuel to utilities.
What does that mean, marketing? Like, it's not like they don't know that they have to buy it.
Market is way of selling it. It's probably a better term. But it could be utilities that have material that in excess, like for example, if you're going to shut down your power station, you have some inventories there that you can't use anymore. They need assistance in selling it to someone else. We've certainly been doing some of those transactions as well. So I guess, yeah, selling is a little narrow because it could be inventory financing. It could be outright purchases. it's just a lot of transaction. You can call us a merchant or an intermediary in the nuclear fuel market.
Okay, I'm sorry for my silly brain immediately went to marketing as in branding and stuff like that.
It's a very quirky market as well. So.
Okay. Well, you're mentioning inventories. Help me. I need you to settle a debate for me. Is there or is there not £1 billion sitting in a shack in the middle of Africa?
If there was, the short answer is no, there is not. There was actually, it was in the news today, I think, with this the Libyan story about some pounds missing in
2.5 million tons. Oh, what was it? 2.5 tons,
which is
2.5
basically
million.
10 drums, which is you can't do a hell of a lot with that. So I don't understand what all the fuss is about. First of all, it's natural uranium. So before you're going to do anything untowards with it, you're going to enrich it. So you're going to have to build an enrichment facility to begin with, unless you want to knock on the door with Urenco or Orano, but then that's going to be under IEA safeguards anyway. So I am not losing any sleep over those 10 drums. I know there was a fair bit of material in Libya at the time of the fall of Gaddafi, but I believe that made it into the civilian nuclear cycle with the help of Orano. But again, I know at Cameco we were looking at it a little bit, but there was a very non-serious seller who didn't really have a claim on it. So it was, kooks. You meet a lot of those in this industry too, and most of the time you ignore them.
You'd see those news often like, oh, somebody tried to cross the border in Iran with like 1 kilogram of uranium. I never know what that means. Most of the time I just ignore it because I don't know if it means anything.
It means that someone doesn't have anything better to write in the newspaper and they want to get some clicks because it's really completely irrelevant.
Okay. Let's talk about inventory. That seems to be sort of the biggest thing in uranium, right? It's also like super opaque. We don't really know how much is in inventory out there, but what can you tell me about the stuff that's, jokes to the side, actual mobile inventory, stuff that can go into eventually EUP?
Yeah, well, I mean, inventories utilities certainly have some, but that's more of a working stock. So that's something they need to work through. There are not piles and piles of uranium sitting on a lot somewhere just ready to hit the market and flood it. Does China have a lot of U3O8? Absolutely, but they also don't have any natural, really uranium resources themselves. So clearly, if you have a big fleet, you need to have some stockpiles. So that makes perfect sense. Does some of that find its way into the market every now and then? Possibly, or I'm quite sure that it does. But they also replenish it with their Namibian assets, and they also have some Kazakh assets as well. And they buy quite a lot in the market. You see them more or less every week, active buying and selling. So it's just something that they do.
How are the Chinese as a buyer of uranium? Do they care about the bifurcation? Because we see things like self-sanctioning in the West, but is that something the Chinese care about?
I mean, I'm sure they buy some from the Russians, just like other countries do as well. Or I mean, every country actually buy from the Russians, not right now. Anyway, to my knowledge, it's only Vattenfall, the Swedish utility, is the only one who imposed harsh self-sanctions on it. I think Urenco certainly did, even though they're not a utility, but they're also another entity that's publicly has said so. Other than that, most people keep buying, and the Chinese do as well. So whether new contracts are being signed, sure, that's a different story. I think in the West, it's not happening. Chinese, hard to tell, but other than that, they're a pretty big actor in the nuclear fuel market, and both buying and selling. So they're just an active player with probably for price discovery purposes, so they know where the market is, how deep it is, and makes perfect sense in my view. And we have very good relationship with them and fairly frequent contact.
Because that's even more opaque. Most of the time, like whatever happens in China is opaque. I know you're talking about the nuclear cycle within China, which is like almost super opaque, and I don't know almost anything about it. So it is interesting. So yeah.
No, I mean, they have facilities there too. Some of them are dual purpose, which means that it can be diverted for military purposes as well. But they're nuclear weapon states, so clearly the other weapon states have similar facilities. So there's nothing untowards with that. It's just the way the world works.
So. Are they building conversion and enrichment facilities right now?
They already have them active, so both conversion and enrichment.
But they're not increasing that.
I don't know actually if they're increasing the capacity or not, but I think they've been ramping up as they build the facilities. But I don't know where they're at in expansion plans. So But
Okay.
some of my colleagues probably know, but I don't really work with the Chinese that much, other than when I meet them in the market. So I can certainly find out, but I don't know off the cuff.
All right. All right. The way you're talking about these things so casual, like either than when I meet them at the market, it's almost like you're going to a farmer's market and you all gather and each takes, a drum of uranium and goes home.
Yeah, not wet markets in Wuhan, that's for sure.
How's buying been on the market though over the recent months versus buying uranium pounds when you started? Or well, let's talk about 2016 because that's sort of the bottom of the market in terms of pricing. How's buying different now than it was back then?
Well, there was a lot of oversupply and overhang in the spot market, I would say. So it's very easy to find material starting in 2016 and all the way up until 2021. And that's 2021 is obviously when juniors started buying quite a lot of material, and SPUT made its entrance into the market. Yellowcake was active. So a lot of funds, they call it investor interest and junior interest. And that tightened up the market. So it's not as readily available anymore as it was. Now, if you're only buying smaller quantities, or small, but you say like in January, February, well, the SPUT bought about 2.4 million pounds, but there had been virtually no activity in Q4 last year. So that gives, other intermediaries who have offtake contracts with suppliers, that replenishes their inventories a little bit. And there wasn't a really clear buyer active in the market. There was some producers in there, some utilities picked up a few pounds here and there, but it certainly wasn't a busy market. So I think a lot of those, call it mobile inventories, just replenished a bit. So it wasn't too difficult to find it, but it clearly wasn't as easy as it was over the last, between 2016 and 2021, that's for sure.
So when someone says, "Oh, we're supposed to have this supply shortage where we have, 130 give or take supply and 180 give or take demand, million pounds U3O8, where is that extra supply coming from is oftentimes the question, and sort of the counter argument towards the bullish argument for uranium. And the question is like, can you tell me where that uranium comes from? If you cannot tell me where it comes from, it means you don't know where it comes from. It means you don't know how much there is more to come. It means you don't know when the bull market is going to start. Therefore, you shouldn't be long uranium. What do you do with that argument?
Well, it has been a lot of secondary supplies. That's how it's met. And that's obviously the underfeeding from enrichers. And I think most investors know today that that's switching, it already has to switch. So it's starting to be overfeeding. And that's obviously a pretty big swing to go from being a supply source of 25 million pounds a year to now it's more of a demand picture, certainly swinging into that. So that's fairly significant. There has been inventories, government inventories also. That's been kind of worked down. The Japanese utilities, even though they don't directly sell into the market, they most likely have siphoned off some material via the trading entities, the Japanese trading houses, for example. So it certainly has trickled into the market, and it has tightened up. And I think, I mean, UX has a report on this, or has mentioned it anyway, where there was going to be a large overhang of secondary supply well into the beginning of 2030. Well, and this was a year or two ago, they already revised it. But then when you had Cameco and Kazakhstan sort of reduce their production and started buying in the spot market to fill into their contracts, started a few years ago, adding on then the investor interest that also bought up some of this material, they publicly say too that number is significantly revised. It's not going to be a secondary supplies overhang is not going to be around for as long anymore either. So it's running out, and it's running out fast.
Japanese, well, because you mentioned the Japanese, they're often mentioned as having all those huge stockpiles over time, and they don't, they're doing reactor extensions and reactor restarts, but they're not going to have to be coming back into the market. What is your feeling about them coming back into the market over the short to medium term?
Yeah, I believe there was a Japanese utility was looking for material last year. So some of them are starting. Otherwise, yeah, they obviously haven't operated for a long time, most of them. So they do have a fair bit of inventory, even though a lot of their contracts were requirements based. So if they're not operating, they don't have to take anything, which means that you're obviously not building up those inventories. And at Cameco and other suppliers, as soon as that event happened, there was a bilateral conversation to be had. You're not going to force them to take a lot of material if they can't use it. So you halt deliveries for years, push them out further out in time. There is a row of different things you can do with that. So whether they sit on a lot of material today, they have some inventories, absolutely, but I don't think those are going to hit the markets. And they didn't do it during the years following Fukushima because they were bought at fairly high prices, and no one wanted to take the loss on their books. So they were kind of had to wait for prices to hit those level. As the market went from 25 up to 50, even 60, you started seeing at least activity at utilities there that they might start to look at getting rid of some of them. But I know from the contracts that was written while I was at Cameco, for example, they were a lot higher. So the market would have to move a lot higher before anything of that would be sold. And now when you have a very different environment in Japan where you're not really you're gonna restart those reactors, a significant portion of them, and you have an energy security issue in this world with the geopolitical situation. So there are a bunch of factors more arguing for, if you have inventories today, you don't want to get rid of them. I mean, if you're not sell them today just to buy them back higher a couple of years from now, what's the point, right? And you're not even sure what the market situation is going to be. Like, it's going to be tighter, but you just don't know what it's going to look like. And the Japanese mentality in general, not just utilities, but in general, I think is fairly risk averse. So they are very methodical, very reasonable, very risk averse. So my guess is we're not going to see much of those inventories come into the market anymore.
It sounds to me like the Japanese are thinking this is going to go from a buyer's to a seller's market over the short run, basically.
Not just the Japanese, I would say anything. I was speaking to a lot of US utilities. I have been talking to European utilities over the last few months, and I continue to do so. And I would say more or less everybody is actively recognizing that it is now a seller's market and not a buyer's market. And we're hearing that reflected in terms as well, in these long-term contracting, the bells and whistles that were there, and they were fairly significant in terms of value with flexibility, floors, ceilings, location options, all those things. They're falling off one after the other as it's switching from a buyer's market to a seller's market. And now it's stripped bare to very straightforward contracts the way sellers want them. And the next thing to move is the price. And arguably, it already has started moving. It's just that we're not seeing them in the published prices because there is an unofficial bifurcation where clearly material originating from Central Asia has to be sold at a discount because there are so many uncertainties around it in terms of supply chain issues and how do you get it to the West where it's actually needed.
I was talking to Jeff Geringer on Twitter on one of his tweets, and I would ask him, hey, why aren't utilities panicking, and are they panicking? And he sort of told me, I don't know if you know who Jeff Geringer is. He's a former fuel buyer.
No, I know. I've met him many times, and I went down to see him in Kansas when he was there and in his previous job too. So I like Jeff a lot. He's very knowledgeable.
Yeah, he definitely is. And that's pretty much what he told me, is that utilities are, the fuel buyers within utilities are generally put there because they're not the type to panic. They're the type to plan it out up front. But how are they, if they're not panicking, how are they reacting to the spiking enrichment and conversion prices and to the bifurcation of the market from your talks with utilities? How are they reacting to it?
I mean, they're obviously moving. They realize, I mean, you look at the Vattenfall, the Swedish utility that, 4 hours after the invasion said that we're not taking any more Russian material. Well, of course, you talk to them the next day and they're actively looking to replace this because they don't sit on their hands. The decision was made on a very executive level. The same executives obviously have the right to say that, now we don't have that income. That material is not coming anymore. We need to replace it. So here's your mandate. Go out and figure it out. And they did. So they were one of the first ones to obviously act on it and got it done. Other utilities, they're getting there. And I mean, some are feeling the pain that there's economic pressures, the stock prices are down, so it's quite hard for them to argue that you need to free up a bunch of funding so I can go and buy some inventory for nuclear fuel that we might not need, may or may not need, and if we do need it, it's probably not for another few years. So it's a difficult discussion for them to have. At the same time, there is a lot of talk of potential sanctions, whether they're direct or not, but the supply chains are starting to sort of squeak a little bit here and there because it's just getting more and more difficult for insurance or freight rates or just getting logistics in place in general. So it's easier for them to make the case to their decision makers at the utilities that we need to focus, we need to build up some of these inventories. In Europe, it's been probably easier because the proximity to Russia and Ukraine, that it's much more part of everyday life for them. And also electricity prices have been so high, and that when you have a reactor, 1,000 something megawatts at those electricity prices, I mean, you were making so much money that there is simply no scenario where you can afford to not have fuel for that.
Yeah, it's what I've been thinking about around utilities buying is that basically when it comes down to buying, they need the EUP, right? They need the uranium fuel. So you start with uranium, then they need to buy uranium first. I guess they need to buy conversion, then they need to buy enrichment, and then fuel fabrication, pretty much. Like if I understand it correctly.
Actually, it's the other way around. And it's you start you start almost backwards because a lot of times you need to design what you need for your fuel bundle first, and to figure out what the core is going to look like, and then you first buy your fuel fabrication, and then you know what that looks like. Then okay, how much EUP do I need to put into these fuel bundles? And once you know that, then you go to the enrichers and you talk about how much enrichments do I need. That's when you decide the tails assay. So how much uranium you're actually going to need. So until you bought the enrichment, you actually don't need exactly how much uranium you need. So when you see it, a lot of European utilities with the VVR, the Russian design reactors, are more or less being forced to buy on very short notice. When you're buying on that short notice and you need to design the fuel bundles based on what your core looks at the moment, that's when you need to go to Westinghouse and you need to buy the fuel fabrication services. Okay, now I know how much EUP I need. Then I need to go to the enrichers. They will tell you, this is the tails assay we're selling you at. And then this is how much UF6 I need. So then you can go and buy uranium and conversion. So it kind of works backwards when you do it in such a near-term demand. If you have a huge fleet, like an EDF or a Constellation, you have so many reactors, of course, then you don't have to do it core by core. Then you can more take a fleet look at it and do it on a much bigger scale.
Would that mean that the spikes that we've seen in the prices of enrichment and conversion that would trickle down to necessarily has to trickle down, or doesn't it have to necessarily trickle down?
I mean, in my view, it will. And I don't know if it's going to be the same price movement because there is more U3O8 around, but it will certainly be at different prices. It's my view anyway. You've seen a big influx of requests for proposals, RFQs, or quotes proposals, RFPs, RFQs, interchangeable anyway, tenders from utilities. So they come out and they were for enrichment and conversion, as suspected, last year. And it certainly see an increase in U3O8 tenders as well. Some of them come out for EUP, like the bundles all in one. Those are for very near term, and that obviously puts spot pressure on all three of those components. But a lot of other ones, we still see a lot of enrichment tenders come in. So that means that you still have more conversion and uranium to come into the next 12 months, certainly. And it's going to be more than just the next 12 months. You're going to see a lot of utility activity. It's just the beginning of a contracting cycle. So we're starting to see the beginning of it. And has it been more activity than over the last 5 years? Absolutely. It's no doubt about it. And partially that's triggered by the security of supply situation from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But even so, it was a natural cycle to start buying it. A lot of utilities during COVID worked from home, and like everybody did. And it's just not as easy to get things done. You got to sit together in meetings. You got to get approvals. We just saw a lot of the purchasing, the procuring was just pushed out. Yeah, we'll deal with it. We can back into the office. There's no rush. Prices are low. So that was percolating in with, like, at some point you need to come to the market anyway. Okay. And now you really have the interest in renewed interest in nuclear energy based on a decarbonization and electrification discussion. So that's like, all right, yeah, we better get going because we might actually expand and certainly extend the life of some of these reactors. And then you add on top of that the geopolitical issues with the Russian war on Ukraine is basically a perfect storm. So utilities, I mean, again, they don't panic because, like you said, that's not in their character. That's why they have those jobs. I mean, fuel buyers, they're pretty like calm, relaxed people. You should see nuclear operators. Nothing faces them. They're actually quite amazing to see them at work. You know, it's just like they're very calm, level-headed people, and clearly that's the same type of people that do the fuel buying as well. So but it's a process. Every utility has a process and procedure you need to follow. You need to work through. So and they are working on it. And you see the activity is just starting.
When you say the activities is just starting, is it likely that we see replacement rate contracting in 2023?
I would think so. Sure, absolutely. I mean, it's the level on 114. I think it's that UX published last year. I think it's something higher than that. They fully acknowledged. Of course, you don't capture everything because a lot of it's reported on a voluntary basis. No one has to report anything. They do it just to sort of get an idea where the prices are to help the price reporters out, because people kind of want to have a rough idea. Everybody wants to hear what everybody else's price is, but they don't want to tell you what their price is. So it's kind of a standoff in that. But you still have a fairly good handle on activity. And you look at, Cameco, who is one of the few who openly will say the numbers. And yeah, their number last year was about 80 million pounds. And, they announced the Ukraine deal, which is between 42 and 67 million pounds, I think, in one deal. But that alone is obviously going to bring up the level. So is it going to be over 150 million this year? I certainly think so.
How are contracts with utilities different in a replacement rate contracting market versus a market that's not contracting at replacement rate? Does that make any sense?
I mean, I would say it's more of a buyers versus sellers market.
Pretty much. Yeah.
I mean, that's probably how I would see it. And I was there during the last really intense contracting period. I was working with Cameco, and I mean, it was pounds flying out the door, and there's no flexibility. There may be a ceiling in there, but then there's going to be a very high floor in there, and it's only for a portion of the material. A lot of it, you want as much market exposure as possible if you're a utility or if you're a producer, because you don't want to. Otherwise, you just turn into a play on cash flows that we have. This is our mining cost. This is what we sell and that's a fixed margin. No one wants that. You want to have exposure to the uranium price. Otherwise, why would you, as an investor, invest in a mining company? You might as well do little cash flow strips.
What about the escalators in those contracts? How would they change? Also, have they moved up since that bottom in 2016, given inflation and all that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they will have to. I'm sure utilities would want them to be capped. And I mean, they were hardwired back at the time for as long as I can remember anyway. Even when the general escalation factor or interest rates were almost negative or close to zero, you still had at least 1% or so. Now utilities, of course, want to cap it. But it's certainly not at 1 or 2% anymore. It's going to be something a lot higher.
So when you look at something that's happening right now, if the general macro picture, the macro background, in terms of macroeconomics, Like, do utilities even care about that, or do they mostly care about, is it a buyer or a seller's market? Like, do they care about what's happening with the banking world, possibly a liquidity crisis and all that? Do the fuel buyers care about that, or are they like hyper focused on only what's happening within the uranium space?
I think in general, we tend to, within our industry, we focus very much on our industry alone because it's something you're going to have news hit the market every week, every 2 weeks. Of course, from just being part of society in general, you can't avoid it. Everybody will know what's going on with the banking world right now and interest rates hikes and all these other things. But as far as buying fuel goes, does that affect your process and your planning for timeline when you're going to buy things? I really don't think so.
Why I'm asking that,
it's on a different timeline. You don't change your attitude from 1 week to the next. It's more of a methodical approach, and it's kind of go along at your own pace kind of thing. And we're used to it, and you can't really force someone into action because most of the time, you don't need to refuel your reactor next month anyway. It's going to be the stuff that you buy. You don't necessarily need for another 1 or 2 years at least. So that's why it's like, yeah, if I don't do a deal this week, I can do it 3-4 months from now. That's just fine.
that 1 or 2 years that you just said, is that just as an example, or is that really how much longer utilities can keep delaying?
Most of the time, when I was working at utilities, if you buy a U3O8 today, you're gonna put it in your reactor 3-4 years from now. So that's in a regular world. But then, of course, now when you have disruptions in supply chains, threat of that, and if you're this VVR reactors, the Russian design, where your fuel bundles are not coming anymore, well, of course, that's a different situation. So then you have to act much sooner. But that's an exception more than a norm for sure.
There's also, I guess, an assumption that a utility has to make as to how much can we count on the spot market, right? Or like, where do they take the spot market into account really in their decision-making process?
I mean, I think maybe prior to the 2007 spike, there was a fair bit of utilities that just bought just in time kind of thing. Like, oh, we need some spot uranium, let's buy that, send it over to the converter, and then send it over to the enricher whenever we need it, because we have our enrichment contract in place, and that's it. Now, some of them got burned pretty bad on the price run up, and one notorious case, I think the highest transaction was 138.50. And of course, you don't want to be that buyer at that price. But on the other hand, it's 100,000 pounds. So you take that overall, like an average cost of your entire inventory. It's not that high, but you still don't want to be forced to buy in that market. So I wouldn't say that you consider it that much. You just got to be aware of what the spot market is, but you don't rely on the spot market to buy the uranium that you need. You see utilities step in every now and then, like they've done over the last couple of weeks, when they think drops down below $50. This seems like a fairly affordable price right now, and then you pick up some and put it in your strategic inventory, because clearly there is heightened awareness of the threat of potential sanctions, or at least supply disruptions. So then it's only prudent to pick up a little bit of material, but more opportunistically. It's not driven by an absolute need. It's driven by this seems like a good price. It's more being opportunistic.
So if there was something like the SPUT reliability index, it would be like in terminal decline since 2007 to now, and now possibly it even had another dip.
Yes, but on the other hand, when you said like these the VVR, and I keep saying the VVR reactor operators, but they are a very good example where they need spot U3O8, but also spot conversion and spot enrichment, and it's very, very rare. So that's a pretty unique situation that hasn't really hit the market just yet, but it will hit the market throughout the course of this year, and it will remain so for a couple of years at least.
Well, I'm saying that if there was a spot reliability index, I'm sort of giving myself a business idea as I do that. But why I'm talking about this is because it seems like, we hear Kazanprom talking about, hey, we understand the market much better now than last time around. We don't want to flood it. You hear Cameco talking about supply discipline or whatever they call it, basically saying, we're paying closer attention to how much we really put into the spot market. You have SPUT removing pounds that are sent to what people on the internet would call uranium heaven, because they're not meant to go out of there. And it seems to me like the spot market is just becoming, if you're a buyer of uranium, it's just becoming less and less reliable. Basically, that's what I'm getting to.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. No, absolutely. No one. As a fuel buyer at the utility, you have one job, and that's make sure the fuel is there. And I mean, sure, for their individual groups, they probably have. Of course, you want to buy at the lowest price possible, but I don't think you're going to get fired if you have to buy uranium at $70 instead of $50. Your operational cost is going to go up a little bit, absolutely, but you still have the fuel to run your reactor, and that's the absolute crucial part of your job. You need to make sure that the material is there. And so no one is going to be relying on the spot market to buy the uranium they need to stick in their reactors, like a couple of months from now. It's just not the case. You think a little further ahead than that.
Okay. So when utilities are not contracting at replacement rate contracting, that's not because they're trying to get the better price. That's simply because it doesn't fit their current strategy, I guess.
No, exactly. They don't see the need for it too, because I mean, if you buy and take delivery right away, well, then you blow up your balance sheet, and you don't necessarily want to do that. You have a financing department who doesn't want to see you do that either. So.
Oh, okay. So yeah, well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Something that I didn't think about, but it's like, yeah, the fuel buyer doesn't, he or she doesn't spend their own money. They have to go, I guess, through the CFO or whoever it might be to say like, okay, now you can go and buy. So the financials do play a role.
Yeah, these are very big purchases, so that's definitely something that in a lot of cases go all the way up to the board. And then you need to have a couple of board meetings in between, because they're very big investment decisions. So you could take a few months to just get an approval to buy something.
It must be frustrating for fuel buyers if they see something like right now brewing and be stamping on like, we got to go, we have to be buying pounds right now, but then maybe the board doesn't understand the situation as well. So it must be frustrating. I can imagine it.
Yeah, you should talk to Jeff about that. I mean, he's very good at telling people, like, I'm sure he did as well as anyone conceivably could when he came to try to convince the board about that too. But these fuel buyers, they're good. They know the fuel markets. They see a good deal. They know it's a good deal, but they've got to be pulling their hair out. I mean, I'm sure it's frustrating an investment company if you can't convince your CIO that it's a good buying opportunity, and then I told you so in the rearview mirror. You can probably take that times a factor of 10 or 100 in a utility. So.
Wow. Okay. I want to go back to what I said about the macroeconomic situation, because while it maybe doesn't matter too much to utilities, I'm wondering, like, so if there was some type of a liquidity event though in the market, the premium to NAV for SPUT would fall to negative, and so you wouldn't be able to basically raise money and buy more pounds. And you're not going to be putting as much pressure, upwards pressure on the spot market, right? So I guess that's going to matter in terms of pricing, I assume, right?
Well, I mean, I would also say like SPUT is not the only one who's active in the spot market. Like clearly, it has been a very active buyer over the last year or two, but it's certainly not the only one. You have the producers are in there because they are short, officially short. Cameco would be the first one to say that we don't have any material this year. Anything we sell, we have to buy ourselves. And I think they still have to buy even if they don't sell anymore, because they're just technically short. The Kazakh's probably the same. You have utilities in there. You certainly have intermediaries are in there, traders to buy too for future contract that they may have already sort of unwound their carry trades when there was a blip up in the market from 25 to 50. We saw a lot of carry trades come in. And I don't think not necessarily all players automatically replenish that. They just thought, oh, we'll buy it down the road a little bit. So there are definitely other buyers there too, and yeah, it's very unpredictable, the spot market. How the volumes, like yesterday afternoon was 500,000 pounds traded. Some days you don't see any transactions at all. So it's very hard to predict.
Well, at the beginning, I mentioned that you're sort of famous within the uranium investing community. One of the things you're most famous for is the Per Jander bottom, the Per Jander. That's a $50 bottom, and it seems like I looked at the numerical numbers before we started shooting, and it's just sort of broken right below it. What's your confidence in that Per Jander bottom of $50?
Yeah,
Are we going to reach it?
I never heard that either, and I will. Yeah, sad to say that it's already gone below 50 then in that case, because there's been a bunch of transactions below 50. But of course, it's also like, yeah, I'm not gonna sort of stay and say like it never go below 50. I could not predict more or less a banking crisis. I think Credit Suisse at one point yesterday was down 25%. The markets are very shaky in general. So if you have a healthy, stable market environment, I will absolutely stand by the $50 floor. If everybody's flailing in the equity markets and SPUT's trading at a 15% discount and clearly nowhere in sight will be buying any uranium. Other traders are forced to sell, maybe for the liquidity reasons in other places, because we did see some traders dumping uranium in the spot market yesterday. That's hard to predict. So, but was any utility buying yesterday? No, they were not. So they will probably look at it right now and it's like, oh yeah, this is fairly attractive pricing, but is this the bottom? They're ready to buy, but they're also, why would you want to buy? You're not going to catch a falling knife. You want to buy when it's the cheapest. So they will wait for things to stabilize a bit, and then you will. I'm quite certain that when we saw buyers pick up 500,000 pounds yesterday, but of course, entity has to be selling them as well. But they were definitely, those transactions were initiated by the sellers.
Well, they should watch more YouTube videos because they're going to hear you saying that it's the $50 bottom. So they know every time it hits 50, they're going to buy. And then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It works.
Yeah, but that level has kind of stepped up. And I think that's kind of what we were seeing last fall. And it was the level when you saw producers and utilities who do more the opportunistic buying. I mean, SPUT, when they come into the market, it's very prescriptive. Yeah, you're trading at a premium, you raise funds, you buy. So other funds, they might be less prescriptive if they buy on that. Again, there's certainly some hedge funds in there who have their own accounts, and they can obviously be opportunistic as well. We think this is a good time to buy. They might have other reasons for it, but yeah, SPUT is prescriptive, and utilities and producers are more opportunistic. And they came in Q3 last year, that was 46, and then you saw that level steadily creep up, because then it comes up over 50 again and comes back down. Now it's 47 they buy, and then it was 48, and it was 49, and then it seemed anything below 50 people think it's a pretty good deal, because the fundamentals, if you look at those, that's like, yeah, we think there's a lot more upside than downside, and that just seems like a good price. And talk to utilities in general, they said, yeah, I would pick up material at anything below 50, but if it's 49, 50 or 49 and everything is red on the general markets and banks are failing, like, why should I pay 49? It might actually go lower. So it's more a situation where the macro side of things actually impacts our market too.
That's a good example. It's a good example. Is there a pair ceiling, like for the uranium, like it? Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what that would be. I mean, it would take some kind of equilibrium out in time. I think I referred to it on a talk yesterday that this was 15 years ago, that extracting uranium from seawater is $400 a pound. Of course, there can be technological advances from that, but you're going to have to move a lot of water to get any meaningful amount of uranium. Of course, you can start recycling uranium, but it is quite expensive. So not a lot of countries have been looking at that because, I mean, primarily it's for plutonium production. You do that. So you can say that it's good. You have the facility. You might as well use it. And I think the French, as a goal, want to do about 10% of their demand recycling, which is, of course, great. But it's just dissolving highly radioactive material. Then you have it in liquid form. It's just messy. So it is very expensive to manage that kind of radioactivity. It's just harder to contain. So most countries just figured uranium is actually quite affordable, whether it's $50, whether it's $100, you can still afford it. In the grand scheme of things, it will not affect your operating cost that much for a power station. So the once through cycle seems to be a very good way to do it. Sure, there's always talk about thorium. Well, if you're going to use thorium, you might as well use depleted uranium or some other fertile material that is not fissile but fertile. So you need to do something about it first. Most of the time, you radiate it with neutrons. So you can do that too, but again, it's pretty damn expensive. So then you're going to have to build a special kind of reactor for it. There was a reason why people went with the light water reactor technology in the 50s. That sure, enriching it's fine, it's expensive, but it's still arguably better. The Canadians obviously have their own, but then you got to deal with heavy water and you do kind of tritium production, and then again you have isotopes in water, and it's harder to manage from a radiation perspective. So I think that's why the world settled on the light water technology in the 50s. Clearly better. People are better suited to speak to this than I am, but that's the common sense sort of argument that prevailed at the time. So that's why we have the reactors we have today. And yeah, all the economics point to a once through cycle. There's still not a huge amount of waste that you get from it, the used fuel. So that, in my view, that's going to keep being used for the time being. And I know I'm dancing around the number on the ceiling, but I really don't know what it is. But I also know that I don't know what the price of uranium is, where it doesn't make sense to operate your power station anymore. Because if you have a slight increase in electricity price, you can have a quite significant increase in uranium price, and your economics are still doing just fine.
I've heard, but have not double checked the numbers, that it's the cost to run the cost of uranium for the total cost to run the reactor is about 5%. I don't know if that makes sense.
Oh, no, on the uranium itself, yeah. Then you got to add conversion, you got to add enrichment and fuel fabrication. So I think between 15 and 20% all in is on the high end of things. I know at the reactor where I worked, but it was a reactor that was 40 years old. It was running very smoothly, and so it was an ideal situation. And then I would say the fuel cost there was probably 5 to 10%. So, but that's the order of magnitude anyway. So and I think if we're moving to a decarbonization world and a world with electrification of the transport sector, I think no one's going to have an issue with electricity prices going up. It's just like you're going to have to build a lot of investments in renewables, in other nuclear power stations, and whatever other low carbon technology you can find. That's going to cost a little bit of money. People are going to have to pay higher electricity prices. And if you pay a little bit of higher electricity prices, the uranium price or the uranium cost of that is more or less irrelevant in my view.
Okay.
So I'm not concerned about a ceiling, what that ceiling is.
Right. That makes sense. Hopefully when they start building green, renewable energies, though, this time they build it in places where it makes sense, where they don't freeze the wind turbines or have the solar panels covered in snow. But so in conclusion, we are closer to the pair bottom than we are to the pair ceiling. That's what I was getting at.
Oh, absolutely, yes. We're very, very close to the bottom, and the ceiling. Yeah, there is no real ceiling, but it's a very skewed bell curve, if you will. It's definitely the log normal look where there's a lot more upside and downside. The downside is very, very small at this point, in my view.
Remind me, how long ago did you start buying uranium for SPUT?
It was in August 21.
21. Okay, so it's almost 2 years. When you 1.5 years. When you started buying, though, did you expect that 1.5 years into the future we would be closer to the bottom than the ceiling, or did you expect the price to have moved up more?
I would not have expected the price to be where it was, because I wouldn't have expected, never in my wildest dream would I have expected to be buying over 40 million pounds of uranium. That was completely unheard of. So not even at Cameco did we ever get close to that. So if someone would have told me at that point, when the market was, I don't know, high 20s, I believe, maybe low 30s, that a year and a half from now we're going to be at $50, and you, Per, are going to be considering that that's very much on the low end of things. Yeah, it's I've just been shaking my head. But I also would have been saying that the scenario we're in would, first of all, that Russia would invade Ukraine, completely ridiculous. And also all the positive news regarding nuclear energy, like the global debate, if you will, the entire climate around it. It's just that it's the stigma is being removed. You have Greens in Finland actually touting nuclear energy as a good technology, the best option, if you will, for a large scale implementation of a low carbon technology. That I'd say like that's kind of like it's a utopian dream, great, but good thing, that very bad thing with the Russian war. But again, like making predictions, the only thing you know is that they're not going to be accurate, but at least it's always a good exercise to sort of look at the knowledge I have today, try to predict it into the future, and then see what you missed, see what you got right, and learn from that, and always try to improve. So
I heard somebody say that predictions are kind of like dirty socks. We all have them, and we all think that ours don't stink. I'm paraphrasing here, but I'm sure that some of these questions might sound silly to you, but it's just that you see, you would see people on the internet commenting, being frustrated with this not moving as quickly as they expected. They would say stuff like, "Oh, they have SPUT removing 40+ million pounds from the spot market, and the price hasn't moved." And you constantly, you're saying, "Oh, it's going to get better over time," and then it's 2 years and nothing has changed for the uranium markets. And these things are just, not true. The price has moved up significantly, and there are constantly positive developments for the uranium market. That's at least what I'm getting from this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I mean, absolutely, the price has moved, and I mean, I know that the market is different. There was a very large supply overhang in 2021. There was when there was no problem at all to buy 1 million pounds in an hour if you wanted to. I mean, we were, even before SPUT was launched, and when all the juniors started buying at WMC, we were certainly active in getting financing deals. So we just bought cheap spot price pounds, and we had good financing, access to financing, would sell it at fixed prices out in time to utilities. We did all day long. We bought a lot of material doing that. It was no problem at all. Today, well, first of all, financing rates are higher, but even if we did have good financing rates, if you're going to buy 1 million or 2 million pounds, like the market is going to move. So now you have to sit down and think, well, how much is it going to move? So what price can we offer? And you almost have to do it lockstep. You got to have a very understanding utility customers that we might not know exactly what the price is. So it's going to have to fix it over a couple of weeks or whatever it's going to take when we source this material. So it is a very, very different market. And if a big need comes into the market, which I think it will, from utilities who need the material on fairly short term, it will move the market. I don't know how much it will move the market, but I know that it will move the market.
Mm-hmm. When I first started interviewing people about uranium, must have been 2020. One of the first people I interviewed was Rick Trull, and he told me back then that the most important development in the market then was the restarts, the pace of Japanese restarts. Would you have agreed with him back in the day? And the thing, though, is that when I asked him that a couple of months ago as well, he said the same thing. So he still thinks that's the most important development. Would you have agreed with him back then? And do you agree with him now?
It certainly is a very important factor because of all the stigma around Fukushima as well. It's like, oh, Japan is never going to come back. But now you have so much positive news out of Japan that they're going to restart the reactors. They're going to have 60-year lifetime, and it might even be more. Obviously, the US, you already have 80 years. So I see no reason. The Japanese take very good care of the reactors. So I have no reason to believe that they would be any shorter there. So that demand is there. It's a very good bellwether, but equally good is to see, of course, that you have Diablo Canyon in the United States is going to stay on. You have power upgrades pretty much at every reactor that's around 10, 20-year life extensions. So it's more on a global scale. I look at it from a demand picture. It doesn't necessarily have to be Japan, but Japan is a very it's a very sort of visible and clear sign because of the connection with Fukushima and what happened there. But yeah, the 180 turn in Korea is huge as well. India is growing very fast. China is growing very fast. The UK is going to be 25% nuclear now by 2050, I think they say. So they're going to be building, 15 something reactors. France is quite aggressive on their building new reactors as well. And Europe was really declining, just as Japan was obviously completely dead. But now you have these big, important jurisdictions that are completely coming around and expanding or even embarking on new nuclear projects. Like if Saudi Arabia decides to build 14 reactors, well, they're going to build 14 reactors. So yeah, it is a global movement, absolutely. Japan is clearly important, but it's maybe more symbolic than anything else.
Then what is then the most important development right now?
I think it's just the expansion of nuclear in general. And it's not just, there's always been, people talk about SMRs, they talk about Gen 4 and all these, like, oh, we're going to see demand 10, 15 years from now, which of course, yeah, there's always things out 10, 15 years from now. But what really is important in my view is that reactors today that were slated to shut down are not, and they're being extended for another 10, 20 years. That's immediate demand. That's spot demand that you see hitting the market. That's much, much more important to me than any demand that is over 10 years out in time. But even so, the SMR demand is not 10, 15 years out in time because it's happening in Ontario. They're going to have it online at the end of the 20s. So 28, 29, that fuel's probably going to start being made a few years from now. So that demand is happening much sooner. And the potential market for SMRs is enormous. So that's, again, it's out in time. And whereas I was brushing it off before, I really think it's going to happen. But I focus more on the next 5 years. That's what's important to me. But I feel very confident when I see what's happening in that field that it is going to happen, and it's going to create an even bigger demand.
So over those next 5 years, it's stuff like restarts, reactor life extensions, and stuff like that matter the most to you.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
What would be the biggest challenge for the industry in that case? Is it sort of the Greens sort of call them opposing nuclear in Europe, or like what else could be the biggest challenge?
Yeah, I don't know if. Sure, there's opposition, political opposition. Yeah, Greens, absolutely. I mean, I don't want to put all the Greens in the same box, because clearly a lot of people who are environmentalists that traditionally have been anti-nuclear are actually speaking out in favor of it now. And I think what we've seen over the last year with the energy security really going to the top of the agenda is that we need to do something. And we can't just say that everything is bad and not use electricity anymore, because we also know that we need to have electrification on a much bigger scale in general, just to address climate change issues. So what are we going to do then? And renewables alone won't cut it. So we need to have something else. And that's where it's like where it used to be just our little industry, trying to stand on a soapbox and say, this is really important. Nuclear is the answer. It's not necessarily the industry who's leading that conversation anymore. It's actually media. It's people who weren't in the nuclear field before. It's investors. And I'm very, very happy to see that, because then it's a completely different climate when you have people who are not necessarily going to be debunked as, but you're tainted, you're from the industry. Of course, you're going to be talking, talk up your own industry. I don't have to have that. Like, I'm happy to provide the arguments, but other people who don't have that background are saying absolutely the right things for the right reasons. And I'm very pleased to see that. So the industry now can more focus on, let's get it done. We need a lot of skilled engineers. We need a lot of skilled contract workers, welders, concrete pourers. We need the supply chain to work. We certainly need more young people in the industry. And I think every university that I talked to, they like, oh, we got record applicants for a nuclear program, which is amazing to hear. And there's a lot of industry government partnerships where they want to attract more workforce. So if I'll take those issues anytime, we don't have to worry about the public relations, because other people are actually a lot better at it than the industry itself, people like you and others. It's great to hear them handle that, and we don't really have to. And then we can focus on get this stuff going instead. And that's what the industry does really well. It clearly doesn't do well in self-promotion, but that's like, it's good that we don't need to focus on that anymore.
It went the other way around for me, by the way. I first got interested into uranium as an investment opportunity, then started looking more into it, and then figured out like, okay, this is, nuclear energy is pretty much it. And definitely for most places around the developed world that can afford it, it makes the most sense. And then that's when I sort of started looking more into it, sharing some stuff on Twitter, interviewing more people on the channel, people from the nuclear industry, not only specifically on uranium. And that's sort of how it went for me. And given that it's happened to me, I'm pretty much an average Joe. I'm saying pretty much because for most of the things I come short, but I would like to believe that I am pretty much an average Joe. And I assume that that's the case for many other people as well, that they one way or another watched Chernobyl or another bad documentary, almost a mockumentary on Netflix, and they started looking into it as in, hey, is this really that bad? And then they turned out to, they realized, hey, it's really not that bad. So I imagine that's how it went for many people.
No, and it's so good to hear that. And I really see that as well, because I've been frustrated with media for so long because it is so biased. And you can just tell. It's like there are people who grew up in the 70s and 80s, and they were very anti-nuclear. They didn't like nuclear weapons, and they were probably part of the hippie movement. And, they had a great time partying and all that stuff. And okay, now the weapons aren't really there anymore. So now we need something else to focus on. Let's go after nuclear energy. Like, because in my world, there is not a lot of connection between the two. Pretty much nothing, actually. So it was such a misdirected focus in my, and it ruined a lot of things. Again, it's like the industry is not good at self-promotion, and it was a very easy target for, that someone were very emotional and could appeal to people. It was very difficult. I was at the UN meetings, and I was supposed to, a 25-year-old guy is supposed to argue with these seasoned Greenpeace members. Of course, they had a field day with you. It's like, oh, you're just a little industry person. You're just getting paid by them. And I wasn't getting paid a lot, by the way, because I actually believed in it at the time, but they were mocking me. And now I'm saying exactly the same reasons or the same arguments to investors who are a lot younger than I am. That most of the audience I talk to, they're in the 20s and 30s. And they get it. Like, I don't even have to say anything. They come up, well, you should just say it this way instead. This makes much more sense. And it's like, yeah, you're absolutely right. So not only is it that the world has changed in the way that we have a bigger issue to face, we're more concerned with decarbonization and electrification, the natural progression of that history, the people who were part of that movement, they're not around anymore. I'm not saying that they're dead. I'm just saying that they're retired, they're not active, and most of them are not as vocal anymore. They found other things to worry about. And you have a completely new demographic, such as yourself, coming in with much more open eyes, and they look at it with not that lens of history. And it's like, well, what's the problem? They're more asking like, how can this not have progressed any more than it already has? So it's that has completely swung, and I guess I'm dating myself and that I was part of that before, and now I'm seeing the swing. But it gives me a lot of assurance, and it gives me a lot of hope to see that when the new generations who come in, it's gonna be the decision-making generations for decades to come. They get it, and they get it much quicker than people that I've seen over the past few decades, and it's a good thing.
I think it mostly comes down to proper information, because to give you an example, and I think that most of the people who are sort of anti-nuclear, but not aggressively anti-nuclear, they mean well. They don't mean, like, they're not bad people. Why I'm saying this is because I have a personal example, which was my mom. My mom was anti-nuclear till like maybe a year or two ago, because she grew she grew up in communist Bulgaria, and the news that they got was mostly bad around it. And so when Chernobyl happened, for example, my brother was born in 85, and he went bald when he was like 19, 20 years old. And for some reason, everybody believed that people around his age went bald because of Chernobyl, which makes absolutely no sense. Chernobyl happened in Ukraine, Bulgaria. For Americans, it might seem like it's, the backyard, but it's not. It's pretty far apart. And it was just the information that she had gotten over the years was mostly anti-nuclear. So she didn't mean, she didn't mean any ill towards anybody. She's not a bad person, but that's sort of the way she felt, I guess, towards nuclear. And then, when we start talking about it on the dinner table, and she's open for talking about it and stuff like that, and then she realizes okay, I've been mostly lied to. I've been mostly, the victim of media over time, and then they switch naturally. So yeah, she's
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. There has been a lot of misinformation. There hasn't been much fact checking. Today, when people can just take up the phone and fact check something, and there is a fair amount of good objective information out there, they can debunk those things right away. You just don't have to buy into it right away. And on top of that, too, I would say most of the time, it's like electricity is always there. It's almost like a basic human right, and it should also be affordable. And now you've had the situation over the last year or so in Europe where electricity prices have gone up quite a bit. I travel over there 7-8 times a year, and every day when I'm there, it's like if it's in an airplane or in a train or in a bar or a restaurant, anywhere I am, I overhear conversations regarding energy, and it's reasonable arguments. These people are actually, they're not just making things up. They are well aware, they're well educated, and it's just a completely different level of the discussion in general. It's much more mature, and people know what they're talking about. So unfortunately, I think it took a little bit of that pain to have those electricity prices, because people are, well, why is it expensive? And they're like, well, why did we shut down the nuclear power stations then? Why are the renewables not delivering all the time? How does this the energy system, how does it work? And the right questions are starting to be asked, and then people are starting to find answers to that as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just to go back to the investment part of it all, the thing that selfishly interests me the most is why I'm asking these questions is what is the most important thing? What are the bigger challenges for it? Why I'm asking you this is to sort of try and test my thesis, basically try and figure out what might be a bear thesis. What am I missing here as an inexperienced investor? What is something that I'm not paying enough attention to, or not attributing enough risk value to, if you will? What is that thing? Let me ask you that directly. What do you think is sort of the bear thesis for uranium going forward?
It's really tough because, in the physical market, I only see it going one way. I can't speak to equities. Like I said before, I cannot explain the movements in the equity markets because the thesis for uranium hasn't changed, but then the equities bounce around all over the place anyway. So it's I get it that it's tied to the bigger market movements and the sentiment in the world in general. Obviously war is never good, and it's like you print a bunch of money for a few years. Clearly, that's going to drive up inflation. Like all those macro events trickle over into this space as well. But as far as uranium itself goes and nuclear energy and the thesis for it, it's really hard to say oh, this is something we don't want to have a huge accident again, but I feel pretty confident that it's very low risk of that. And the accidents that we have had, there's been fairly good reasons for them. Or Fukushima, you say Fukushima and everybody thinks nuclear disaster. Well, 20,000 people died from a tsunami and an earthquake. No one died from a nuclear accident. Financial damage, absolutely. But put it in perspective, please, right? Or 3 Mile Island. It's from a nuclear safety perspective, it's almost a success story. The plant did exactly what it was supposed to do. So it kind of protected itself. Chernobyl, absolutely, that's unforgivable. But that design should never have been operating to begin with. And there were so many missed human errors and conscious mistakes made, or bypassing security systems, operating in a zone where you should never have been operating in. The list goes on and on and on. So I feel pretty good about that. The threat of accidents, like if it does happen, there are ways of managing that too. And then a lot of the times the dangers with it are really overblown. People on the west coast of the US, iodine tablets sold out because of Fukushima. They thought they were going to be, isotope littering all over the beaches and we're all going to have iodine everywhere. And it's just, I get human fear. It can be irrational, but at the same time, every discussion around nuclear energy here, it's on a much more, it's on a rational level and is not driven by emotions anymore. And I think that's a good first step in making the right decisions.
So when it comes down to a bear thesis, it's something that can only slow down the price would be the developments of global events, basically in the macro world. Is that it?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. And you need to be able to, the industry needs to be able to respond and actually expand as well as quickly as possible, and not cutting corners. And cut corners is not something that happens. I think it's going to be more the pace at which you can build out and expand the nuclear programs around the world. It's going to be frustrating because it's not, it takes time to build these things. And it has to take time. Sure, 5 years for permits, that can probably cut down quite a bit. But the actual construction time itself, you have to let it take time because these things are supposed to last for a very long time and be safe.
Right. You personally, though, you oftentimes say that you don't want to talk about the equities. Is that like, are you not investing at all in uranium stocks, or do you just not want to talk about it because you're not as confident in your expertise, or like how should?
No, I don't invest in individual stocks. If I do anything, it's basically just a basket. Nuclear energy in general, that's fine. And I don't check them every day. I don't try to trade. I don't have time for that. And quite frankly, I want to be able to sleep at night. So it's I have a conscious decision where I don't adjust anything on a daily basis. I check in on it every few weeks or so, just to of course, I have to be aware of general markets, but as far as my own holdings, I can honestly say that I don't check on it every day. I believe in the sector, and that's what I invest in, and I intend to work in it for another 10, 20 years, and then I'll worry about it. But in that 10, 20 years, I really think we're going to see a very good expansion of it. At the same time, I'm obviously, my entire career is invested in it, so I also have some diversification. And even though I want to put all my money in it, I also need to do, that's when the nuclear side of things come in, that you don't put all the eggs in one basket. There's redundancies, belts, suspenders, all that stuff. So you need to invest in something else. But that's also what we're doing at WMC, the company I work with. That's why we're focusing on battery materials, for example. That we just like, it's not like it's a substitute in any way, but it's all moving towards an energy transition, because the energy transition, that I believe will happen regardless. Not saying that we're not going to need fossil fuels for the foreseeable future, because we do, but at least that does not mean that we shouldn't try just to make the transition happen as soon as possible anyway, within reason.
I think you make a very important point, especially for the people who might be listening to talks like this and getting like super uber bullish on uranium, and then being like, okay, my kids, they got to go to college, and that's important, but uranium is importanter. Let's just put all the money into this. Here's for someone like yourself, putting all your money in one, someone who is an actual expert on the inner workings of the physical market of uranium. You're not going 100% into it because you really never should in one thing, whatever that might be. So I think that's a very important point on your end.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a gambler. I'm not a gambler by nature, and people in the nuclear industry tend to not be gamblers either. And they shouldn't, for all the right reasons.
Also, another reason might be that it just takes much longer than most of us can stomach. Like, this is a very long-term industry. It was recently, I want to remember who said it. Someone said that you have different markets that look, for example, the egg market, what's been happening with eggs this time during this year, the cycles are much quicker. And then you move, up the commodity chain, and then you have cycles that take longer and longer and longer. And then pretty much all the way at the end of the commodity chain, you have uranium, which is the cycles take a very, very long time normally. Is that true? Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, uranium takes a long time. I mean, it's still from a global perspective, it's a pretty young industry as well, right? It took off commercially in late 60s, early 70s, huge boom, started building reactors, and they really could produce a lot of reactors on fairly short time. It took 2 to 3 years to build them. And I'm sure we can get there again. And I think we need to get there again. But then it's been very quiet for 20, 30 years almost. And now the move back then was obviously, let's move away from, again, oil dependence and other things. But now I think the potential expansion of the nuclear field now, basically the second time in history it can happen, is on a much bigger scale than it was in the 70s. So you think about those two things, like there's not that's the size of the cycle, if you will. And I don't know what the downturn would be either. Like, yeah, sure, we're going to move to fusion at some point, and maybe there are other ways of creating energy that are even better. But then you won't need really any other means of making electricity. But that's, in my view, that's before it's commercialized, that's 50, 60 years out in time. And even though I want to live long, I don't want to live that long. So as far as I'm concerned, nuclear energy is the way to go for the time being. And absolutely, we should do everything we can with battery materials or battery storage to be able to make renewables more reliable as well. But you're going to need everything. Anything that doesn't emit carbon emissions or greenhouse gases, we're going to need it all. And that's my focus, and that's my horizon. And obviously, I don't have kids, but maybe I will have one day, and I certainly have friends to have, and my sisters, nephews, that I want to have that, like they should inherit a good world as well. And I think we're moving in the right direction when it comes to energy. So it's that's what I regard as my calling in life, and that's why I really am fairly passionate about this. But my primary interest is not investments. It's a bit of more of a deeper drive than that.
I think we're exactly at the end of the time that I booked with you. So I'm gonna stop annoying you with my questions and let you enjoy the rest of your week. Is there something that you came here hoping to talk about, but I failed to bring up?
No, it's been very interesting, actually. It's like I really enjoyed it, and hopefully I can come back at some point too. I quite enjoyed it. I didn't know what to expect at all, but I really enjoyed our conversation, and I think you have interesting angles and good questions. So it's like I really enjoyed it, and I'm definitely open to doing it again. So that's I don't have any other messages from you. I think I've been preaching enough as well, but it's been great.
It really has been great. Thank you for being kind to call my angles interesting instead of silly. I appreciate you. And I also appreciate you investing your time with me today.